lecture series, which is organized and sponsored by the Department of Applied Linguistics. We're a graduate department only. We have a master's and a PhD. My name is Panayota Punari, and I'm the chair of the department. Our lecture series brings to Boston scholars with diverse research interests in the field of applied linguistics. And we hope to become a forum where interesting discussions take place between scholars, students, and the broader community. Our talks are free, of course, and open to the public, so you're welcome, to join them. I think this is what a public university should be doing. It should serve as a forum for this kind of intellectual discussions, but it should also anchor to, it should connect those discussions to what's happening in our communities. So if you are interested in learning more about this lecture series, you are welcome to either join our email list or to just like our face on our page on Facebook. Like our face, yes. That's it today. We are thrilled to welcome an incredible world-renowned scholar in the field. And we are extremely thankful that she, honored us with her presence here. And that said, I would like to turn this over to my colleague, Professor Shin, who has worked very closely with today's speaker, and so she can introduce her.
Hi, I'm Taran, working at the Department of Applied Linguistics, and thank you again for coming here and join us for this important and much awaited talk at UMass Boston and at the Department of Applied Linguistics. And I am, of course, very proud to introduce to you Dr. Claire Kramsch, whom I am proud to recognize as my doctoral advisor, my mentor, and my friend. As many of you well know, Claire Kramsch is now retired from UC Berkeley at the German Department and Graduate School of Education, but she also holds an appointment as professor of the Graduate School at the same institution. Working in the field of applied linguistics with emphasis on social, cultural, and stylistic approaches to language study, she is both a prominent scholar and a remarkable teacher. She has published a number of phenomenal articles and books, including Context and Culture in Language Teaching in 1993, Language and Culture in 1995, Language Acquisition and Language Socialization, Ecological Perspectives in 2002, The Multilingual Subject in 2009, and The Multilingual Instructor that will be published in January 2018. In terms of teaching, she has taught thought-provoking courses such as Language and Power, Language and Identity, Second Language Acquisition and Discourse Analysis, and Multilingualism at Cornell, MIT, and UC Berkeley. As the founding director of the Berkeley Language Center, Claire Kramsch has also worked a lot for the research of and professional development for all foreign language teachers on campus. And thanks to her scholarly, educational, and professional contributions, she has received many major awards from various organizations. Again, I'm very grateful that Claire could come here and speak to us today in the Department of Applied Linguistics. And personally, Claire has a profound impact on me and my own career, professional and intellectual career, since 2010. So hopefully from this talk, I hope that all of you can at least feel why she has been such an inspiration to many researchers and educators. Without further ado, please join me and welcome Claire Kramsch.
Thanks, Taran, for a very generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to see so many young people here interested in applied linguistics. Before I start, maybe just a footnote on how I got into applied linguistics. I was, at the time when I studied, French. I did all my studies in Paris, studying German studies, German literature. I was not destined to become an applied linguist. I discovered applied linguistics when I started teaching German at MIT for 20, 25 years. And it is my puzzlement at not understanding my students. I don't mean that they didn't have enough German to understand my German, but their mentality. I didn't understand where they came from. I didn't understand the American mentality. And it was not Goethe and Schiller and my German literary studies in France that explained to me my American students. So I started scouring the shelves. I was at MIT, so I went to Widener. I was given a Widener library card, a Harvard card, and I started looking for something that would explain to me why my American students were not talking in class, were asking these questions that seemed to me from left field. I didn't understand why they were asking these questions. And I found all of a sudden one day a transcription of German conversations transcribed in the conversational analytical way. And I said, that is conversation. That is real living language. And that was the beginning of my launching in an interest in discourse analysis, conversation analysis, and the whole field of second language acquisition and applied linguistics. So that was my entry into a field in the social sciences, not having forgotten my original love for literature, poetry, etc. And what you will see in my talk today is a convert, a transfuge, basically from the humanities into the social sciences. And my amazement at this field of applied linguistics that opened my eyes to real speakers, writers, interactors, etc., and how they make meaning in various ways. So just as a frame for my talk. I'm going to be talking indeed, and I have to apologize for the self-promotion of my distributing basically what is Kramsch, and again Kramsch on the reading list that I have given you here, but I have written quite a bit on the teaching of culture in language, in foreign language education. And so some of you might not be so familiar with some of the more outlandish things that I wrote, so I'm giving it to you there, and we'll refer to it from time to time. I have called my talk Translating Culture in the Language Classroom an Historical Challenge, and I'll explain each of these terms as we go on. You will see that I use the word translation in a more metaphorical sense. It is not going to the dictionary and translating one language into another, but basically what you have to do when you're teaching a language, you are trying to express in the language of somebody else something that you lived or something that you believe or that you did in your own language. So any kind of language learning, language teaching is always trying to put somebody else's words on your experience. And that's what I will be trying to discuss today on the basis of the data that I, together with Lihua Zhang, who is my colleague in Chinese at Berkeley, we have worked on a data collection of testimonies of a number of foreign language teachers in the California system, on the 12 campuses of the California system, and that's what I will share with you, the results of these findings that are going to be in that book that is going to come out in January. So my outline basically is starting to pose the problem. What is the problem space? The problem space is that word culture. What do we mean by culture? In a language class, many people would say, my role is not to teach culture, I'm just a language teacher. But of course, we all know that you can't avoid teaching something that we call culture. So I will be talking about that in the introduction. Then I will be talking in 1 and 2 sort of fleshing out what is the problem and why is everybody talking about it and yet doing nothing about it, and why is it surfacing right now in an age of globalization where national boundaries are disappearing more and more, and what with the global social networks and communication technologies, the word culture is becoming different than what it used to be. And then in 3, I will go into the study that I've just conducted and will give you a flavor of what we found. And in the conclusion, I will come back to this notion of the idea that we don't necessarily understand one another, or we very often misunderstand one another, not because we lack the vocabulary, the code, but because we live on different time scales, and because we experience things subjectively and historically in different ways. So, what is culture? Let me give you the definition that I gave, and you have my 1998 little book on your bibliography. In 1998, I defined culture as follows. It's membership in a discourse community that shares a common space, social space and history, and common imaginings. Even when they have left that community, its members may retain, wherever they are, a common system of standards for perceiving, believing, evaluating, and acting, and these standards are generally what is called their culture. So it's something that you share with a group in which you were born, your family, your nation state, your school, your region, etc., and that gives you a way of thinking, a way of behaving. James G. would say a discourse with a big D, a way of apprehending the world around you. This definition, and in that little book I elaborate a little bit, that culture is co-constructed through language. In other words, it is not only given to us by our surrounding, but with every speech act, with every act of language, we contribute and we co-construct with others, we perpetuate a certain way of believing, of acting, of talking, of thinking in the group in which we were socialized, so to speak. And not only through language, but of course through other symbolic systems like the visuals, images, photo albums, and the like. Culture consists of sedimented and shared meanings that we give through these local interactions, these daily interactions, where we as social actors contribute in reinforcing this culture. Culture is, however, nowadays, because of globalization, seen as much more heterogeneous than it used to be when we said, I'm French and therefore I embodied the French culture. What does it mean nowadays, especially when you emigrate? There's nothing like emigrating to the United States to realize that when you say we French, who are we French? It's we, yeah, the people I knew from my hometown in Versailles. But I know nothing of the people who live in Montpellier or Marseille, and I certainly am circumscribed by my generation, etc., etc. So culture is heterogeneous and historically contingent. It is, we have to agree, also multiple. You are not just an American or a French. You are also somebody from the East Coast or from the West Coast. Ethnic, occupational, professional, gender, generation culture. There's a multiplicity of cultures in which each of us has a part. Of course, our culture is linked with our sense of self, our sense of identity. You are proud or not proud of being part of a certain culture, and it gives you a legitimacy, particularly when you're a foreign language teacher. I can reveal something to you. I mean, I have been and am a professor of German, even though I was never German myself. What do you think my legitimacy teaching German comes from? Claire Kramsch. That's not my name. That's the name of my German husband. But I cherish it because it's my legitimacy of being a professor of German and not a French. This is non-trivially important. Okay, and it's linked to moral values and beliefs. you generally think that your culture is better than others. I must admit that coming from France, moving to the United States, I believed that the French culture was unsurpassed. There was, of course, something called American culture, but I mean, I was French. I was not, you know, from any just minor culture. I was the cradle of civilization. Of course, then you very quickly realize there are many cradles of civilization. I've listed here two anecdotes. When I first came to the United States, I had a colleague who was Danish and who on the ski lift somewhere in Vermont encountered an African-American kid who says, "What's your culture?" He asked her, "What's your culture?" And she didn't understand the question. So he said, "See, I'm black. That's my culture. What's your culture?" And she didn't know what to answer. "I'm white." Was that the answer to his question? As you can see, the word culture is used in very many different ways. But I want to give you the second example that you have here, which is of more recent date, and Donald Trump, with the events in Charlottesville, who tweeted, by bringing down the statue of Robert E. Lee, you are changing history, you are changing culture. And now we're starting to wonder, which culture is he talking about? Is it ours? Is it those of the people who manifested in Charlottesville? Is it the South, the North? As you can see, it's becoming a little more difficult to define which is my culture. So, teaching language as culture. Now, learning a foreign language has traditionally been seen as learning a foreign culture, and has been predicated on the fact that in the same way as you can translate one language into another language, surely you can be able to translate or to explain your culture in the foreign language to others. Now, in the communicative activity, language learners, it is believed, learn to catch the logic of foreign language speakers in their own vocabulary. In other words, we're preparing, when I teach them German, I prepare them to go to Germany and explain in German their American culture. Now, as I said, American culture is going to be more difficult to explain under Trump than it was under maybe another president or under other political circumstances. But they're going to have to explain themselves in the foreign language, and they're going to have to find the words to explain to a German what it means to be American. As Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist, once wrote, translation is not simply recasting of others' ways of putting things in terms of our own ways of putting them, but in displaying the logic of their ways of putting them in our vocabularies. So how do you explain to a German who is sure to ask a student, an American student abroad, why did people vote for Trump? Try put that in their vocabularies. And that is what is more and more in this globalized and in this mobile world of us, more and more we have to explain ourselves or explain others to ourselves in their vocabulary. And that is a kind of a translation which is not easy to do. In part because in our digital age, this cultural logic has become much more complex. Culture as the local ways of life and everyday behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs is now linked to all kinds of ways of making meaning, oral, written, visual, digital, that each have their own logic, and culture has become something in people's heads. You are born in one culture, you go to school in another culture, you move to another country, you marry somebody with yet another culture. So we live across various imagined, remembered, experienced cultures, And it's much more difficult to pinpoint, you're American, and therefore that's how I should or should not behave vis-a-vis you. Because there's much more diversity and the landscape has become much more complex. Through the proliferation of communication technologies, the term culture has become more and more associated with two things: historicity and subjectivity. And in fact, Bill Hanks, who is the head of the anthropology department at UC Berkeley, told me the other day that nowadays anthropologists do not study culture anymore. So I said, well, what do they study? Isn't anthropology the study of culture? No, he said. It's the study of historicity and subjectivity, which is very interesting. So under historicity, you understand the lived experiences of people in different times of their lives, the different time scales on which these events are experienced, namely the longer time scale of nations, of groups, your shorter time scales of growing up, becoming a teenager, then an adult, then a father, etc., then a spouse, etc. And the conflicting understandings that these experiences are based on, and the different perceptions that are contingent on one's perception and one's position in history. So culture has become much more a sense of where do you position yourself vis-a-vis your parents, vis-a-vis your peers, vis-a-vis your imagined selves, vis-a-vis the people in history that you learn in your history books. So it's become much more fluid and much more complex. Culture has become a subjective apprehension. Where do you position yourself? The memories of personal experiences lived or recounted, projections and identifications. Look at the people in Charlottesville. When they say, or when Trump tweets, you're changing our culture, which culture is he talking about? He's talking about an American culture of another era, of another decade, and yet he calls it our culture. But one could say that if you don't consider American culture the way Trump does, you are looking perhaps at American culture, the diversity of American cultures, on a different time scales than those who believed in black versus white, south versus north, in the days of Jim Crow or in the days of another period in history in the United States. So it's both the historical span and how you position vis-a-vis. Modernist views on culture, which is generally how textbooks, in language textbooks, represent culture, namely the French wear berets and they drink coffee or wine, with baguette with a lot of butter on it. Okay, that's your stereotype, if you wish. That is the essentialization of culture that you find a lot still in textbooks that pretend that the culture of a nation is as simple as the syntax of its grammar, of its lexical, of its linguistic grammar. So the notion that they are stable truths, that you can prepare students to know whether or not to shake hands when you meet a French person, etc., and you learn all these little tricks and you will be accepted in that culture, is less and less possible nowadays. So this modernist view is less and less possible because it's given way to postmodern views of relationality, contingency, it depends, and more you get the feeling, should I not shake your hand? And you should not ask, you should know. So you ask somebody else, and the response is sure to be, well, it depends. It depends on the time of the day, it depends on the person, it depends on how you feel. So, okay, I've called language teaching as an act of translation because when you teach language, you have to prepare the students for a context which is complex, as we have seen, and has no equivalence. And what I have here on this slide is the assumption of equivalence that comes from language teaching, where we imagine that if we have a good enough dictionary, we will find the equivalent of one word and the other. In terms of culture, is less and less equivalent, because cultures are less and less equivalent and less easy to translate into the words of another. So, in particular, intercultural language teaching assumes that cultural experiences and values can be shared, discussed, and negotiated, and you have many people who are interested in culture in big corporations who want to keep their workforce, their multinational, multicultural workforce at peace and in harmony. So how do you behave with a Korean? How do you behave with a Chinese? How do you behave with a Japanese? And they like these little recipes, these hard and fast how-to ways of behaving, which are totally artificial and will create more difficulty than in fact they solve. This slide just summarizes the challenges that we have for the teaching of classroom culture in classrooms. We have these four attempted solutions to teaching culture in language classes. Intercultural learning, which assumed that there is something like an American, a French, a German, a Korean, and a Chinese that is too stereotypical and deals with increasingly divided societies, so that is a problem. The demand for authenticity. Students like to think we're going to learn the genuine product, the authentic way of behaving. Authenticity with the internet is becoming more and more problematic. What is the you have lots of people playing at being French, playing at being Korean, etc., and it depends on the situation. In my number 3, I just reference people, particularly in the teaching of English, but also in other languages. What people are talking nowadays is not sticking to one language, but translanguaging, which is code meshing, code switching, and using multiple languages as if they were one language. That is the proposed solution to the cultural problem. But it creates problems of its own when you're dealing with a lot of still monolingual native speakers in the various countries that you will go to. So I will try and summarize what I want to, this kind of introductory part of my talk. I want to emphasize the fact that in order to reteach language, whether it's English or foreign languages, in order to better understand one another. That is non-controversial. But cross-cultural understanding cannot be achieved without the translation of the experience of one person into the vocabulary of another, or into the experience of another. In other words, for me to understand my MIT students when I first came to the US, it was not, I understood their vocabulary. I understood what they said, but I didn't know why they said it. They couldn't explain to me the difference between democracy and capitalism. Why not? Isn't there any difference? I kept telling them that fascism could happen in America. They didn't believe me. Well, now they would. But I couldn't understand, what do they mean by fascism? They certainly didn't seem to mean the same thing as I did coming from French. So it was not a linguistic problem, it was that my experience growing up in France under fascism was not the experience of my students living in a democracy under capitalism. There was a lot of things I didn't understand. So, How can, in fact, the teacher in language classes bridge those different time scales of experience through the foreign language, when, in fact, when you're teaching students of different levels of maturity, because very often in college you teach kids of 18, 19, 20, they haven't had the same experience, nor even the length of experience that you have had, by definition, since you're the teacher or the professor. When teachers are under rigid institutional constraints, language teachers very often fear for their job, and they are dependent on enrollments. So they want to please their students. So they don't want to talk about controversial topics such as America becoming fascist. Whoa, no politics in the classroom. We don't want to touch that. So how could I possibly get an answer to my burning questions when I first came to the US? And very many teachers feel that it's not part of their professional identity. We're just language teachers. But how can you separate language and culture, meaning the meaning of the cultural meaning of the language? So these were the questions that we had in my mind when, together with Lihua Zhang, who herself is Chinese and grew up during the Cultural Revolution in China, learned China by going to the countryside to help the peasants under Mao, learned German in the countryside, became a teacher of German in China, and then decided she had to go to Germany to find out what the Germans think. So she went to the capitalistic abroad for the first time, discovered capitalism in Germany, and found out that what the Germans were dreaming about, all the Germans were dreaming about only one thing: coming to America. So she said, well, then I've got to go to America to find out what all the Germans are dreaming about. So she came to America, decided to do a PhD in my department, in my German department at Berkeley. So there you have a French person teaching a Chinese how to teach German in the United States. Now, that was interesting. And we were a little bit, we had similar biographies, so we decided to write this book together. And I want to share with you some of the things that we asked and some of the things that we did. So we wanted to find out how these teachers, in fact, translated, whether they were native speakers or non-native speakers. How did they convey, how did they translate this German culture, or whatever you call it, and their own in the classroom? And we conducted in 2014 and 2015 a survey of 78 native and non-native language instruction on the 10 campuses of the UC, followed by 1-hour interviews with 18 native and 12 non-native instructors teaching 17 different languages. And one of the main questions of our survey was, do you tell your students about your experiences with the foreign language and culture in your country and in the US, for those who had come from outside the US? And we gathered some 35 narratives, and we examined how these narratives were constructed and how the teachers represented their efforts to deal with the paradoxes of cultural translation. So we wanted to know, how do they do that? So we found out first there were two interesting differences in the way they told their story. And these are captured in a book by Jerome Bruner called Actual Minds, Possible Worlds. Some of you know that book, 1986. It's a very readable book that I recommend to those who don't know it. It shows examples of the paradigmatic and the narrative mode of thought. And to give you an example, we were interviewing, Lihua and I, we interviewed these people simultaneously in English. Occasionally, when it was a French teacher, I would interview them in French. If they were Chinese, they would be interviewed by Lihua in Chinese. And we were talking with Zhao Jing, who is a 29-year-old Chinese instructor from mainland China. We were talking about the potential contradiction of Chinese people eating hamburgers at a McDonald's in China. And I was being provocative, and I wanted to know, eating a McDonald's in China on Tiananmen Square, is the hamburger Chinese? Is it Chinese food or not? The hamburger is Chinese, the workers are Chinese, the bread is Chinese, so it's Chinese food, is it not? So I asked, and this is Claire asking, if culture is a set of values and beliefs that inform, guide, and motivate people's behavior, how do you bring together the McDonald's kind of food that is typically capitalistic? Now, I was really provocative here. But I wanted to, for me, McDonald's, for me, French, McDonald's is a typically capitalistic food on the fly in order to increase production. For me, that's typical capitalism, so to speak. And a Chinese view of communist solidarity and connectivity. Isn't there a contradiction? As I said, I was aware of being provocative. Zhao Jing, not wanting to contradict a white-haired professor, says, well, some Americans wear those kind of traditional Chinese clothes or eat traditional Chinese food with chopsticks. There's no contradiction in that. It's not contradictory, but maybe in China someone eating McDonald's hamburgers is contradictory. You see, she's very tactful. She doesn't want to contradict me, but she does contradict me, and she leaves me a door open. So I said, well, you've already given the answer. You take the chopsticks and eating at McDonald's as behaviors, not as values. These are not values. They're just, well, some people eat with chopsticks, some people eat with their hands, some people eat hamburgers, some people eat chow mein. There's no value to it. You just take off the meaning. And she laughs. In that case, there's no contradiction, right? I don't feel that there is no answer, no direct answer to that. So what I would like to show you, that this way of arguing, I was confrontative, I was provocative, I had already set communism against capitalism, I was your real obnoxious French Cartesian thinker. And I wanted to, because that's the way I think. Okay. Now, and that was a paradigmatic mode of thought, namely a rational, and we'll discuss that a little more later. But all of a sudden, Lihua jumps in. And Zhao Jing says, yeah, I can't find an answer for her. And Lihua, who is mainland Chinese, a fellow Chinese, says it's not the food, the kind of food itself. It's the food actually initially attached to a particular ideology. And what I have put in italics is Lihua's way of telling the story. And you will see it's quite different from mine. She says, see, I give you an example. In my time in China, we used to define life under communism, you know, as the highest goal to reach, right? In a communist society, it was believed the highest form of food would be beef and potatoes. Yes, because this was the food from the Soviet Union, you know? So that kind of food was already ideology, right? It was the kind of the equivalent of communist society itself. This is a totally different way of telling the story. You have C, she gives the historical background, she gives reasons, she gives the why, not like me. So Zhao Jing says, I think time changes and the culture changes. So at that time, beef and potatoes equaled Chinese culture, or something ideological like that. But right now, since times have changed, and also because of globalization, and I latch on, the equal sign means that I pick up on what she says, I build up, and I said the value of beef and potatoes has changed. They don't all have this value attached to the peasants and the simple life and all that. Is what you're saying? So Zhao Jing says, yeah, kind of. And Lihua says, it's a type of food, just a type of food. And she says, Zhao Jing says, yes, yes, or like beef and potatoes can be part of Chinese culture. They can also be part of American culture, like the chopsticks. They can be a Chinese culture or a Japanese culture or something else. As you can see, Lihua's way of telling the story leaves the space open for contradiction. The contradiction is brought together in a harmonious way. So, according to Bruner, there would be two different ways of telling that story. My way, which was the paradigmatic thought, which is confrontative, content-oriented, argumentative, dichotomous, point and counterpoint, you agree, I disagree, etc., appeals to reason and logic. So, is there a contradiction or not? Capitalism versus communism. Morality of conviction, because of course I was sure that I was right, because that's how generally it is, and a search for truth. So what is the truth of the McDonald's hamburgers in Tiananmen Square? See, I was going in front of it. And Lihua's narrative mode of thought, which is listener-oriented. She says, see, I'll give you an example, which is reaching out to the audience, persuasive, trying to make the case, built in a historicity, which I certainly had not built in, an appeal to reason and emotions. Beef and potatoes, that was because we were imitating the Soviet Union. So as you can see, morality of the form. Her story, in fact, follows the Lebovian, 1972, Lebov, abstract orientation. C would be the abstract or the orientation, then comes the complicating action, and then the evaluation. And a search not so much for truth, but for a good story. So these are two different ways of telling the story that I thought were particularly dramatically illustrated by my way of interviewing and Lihua's way of interviewing. I have a second story now, which was told by the Italian instructor. The Italian instructor was also a native instructor, just arrived from Italy. And she was asked, you know, are there stories that you tell your students to show them the difficulty of sharing experience? And she says, oh yeah, I've got a story. And she has just arrived, she's 25-year-old, and she went to Pizza Hut and ordered a pizza with pepperoni. And the vendor brings her a salami pizza. And so she says, I ordered pepperoni. And he was like, yeah. And I was like, this is salami. And he's like, pepperoni is salami, man. And I was like, no, it's not. You translated it wrong. Love. Now that too has a Lebovian structure. Watch. She went to Pizza Hut and ordered a pizza. That's your orientation. Then comes the complicating action. I was like, he was like, I was like, he's like. And then comes the evaluation. No, you translated it wrong. So not only has this story a Lebovian expected kind of structure, but it also illustrates the importance of making meaning. Why was she telling that story? Is that story so important because it's about the difference between American pepperoni and Italian pepperoni? Is that what she was trying to say? What was she trying to say through that story? So let's look at the three dimensions: sequence, pattern, and point of view. Sequence. And I was like, and he was like, and I was like. So first you have the events in a sequence. Then you have a pattern. You have like, he was like, he was like, he was like, and then comes he's like. All of a sudden, the crux, the climate of the story, you switch from the past tense to the present tense. And that is the point of the story. And he's like, switching to the present tense, because he's is not an abbreviation of he was, but he is, and all of a sudden, he's like, pepperoni is salami, man, you're wrong. And then she says, no, I'm the native speaker. I'm Italian. You're not. I'm Italian, and I can tell you, you translated it wrong. So the patterning of I was like, and he was like, and I was like, and he's like. And then the point of view, of course, is the point of view of the native speaker Italian who feels superior to this Italian-American selling pizza that is not pizza or pepperoni, that is not Italian pepperoni. So the story is not at all about pizza and pepperoni. The story is about, in fact, is about the offended pride of an Italian citizen in America. That story is about cultural difference, not about whether, you know, it's pepperoni or salami. So what you read inside those sharing of experience are deep-seated feelings of pride hurt, of offended, and of subjectivity in addition to the events told. I'm going to show you now Amy's story. Amy is a pseudonym, of course, for our Korean instructor, one of our Korean instructors. And I want to show you that sequencing that we saw in the previous story. Amy is a 45-year-old native Korean instructor with a PhD in linguistics. And she's been in the US for 12 years. And she teaches third-year Korean. And when I asked her, have you ever tried to share your experience as a Korean in your language class? And she said, and she answers, I wonder if this example can be the answer. And as an answer, she gives me a story. And here is her story. There's a famous fairy tale in Korea that everyone knows. And of course, I learned it when I was young. So a long time ago, but when I began to teach upper third level, I read it as an official material. It's a story about this fairy who came to the world, to the earth. And then they were taking a bath in the pond because they didn't have enough water in heaven, and she laughs. So they were like doing the bathing, and then a very nice woodcutter, he was like hiding, and then watched it. And the fairies, they had this kind of special costume, and they can fly back to heaven. And then the woodcutter, he didn't get married, so he wanted, but he lived in the forest, so he didn't have a chance to meet women. So he kind of picked up the cloth, the fairy's costume, so she couldn't go back to heaven. And she was the princess of the heaven, something like that. So they got married, and they lived happily ever after. That's how she said it. But there was one thing that the woodcutter had to be cautious about, is that until the fairy got 3 children, he was not supposed to say, okay, you know, I hid your costume. Because with 3 children, she couldn't go back, you know, she couldn't fly back. But she was, you know, homesick. So after they had 2 children, she said, oh, honey, I know you know I still love you, blah, blah, blah. But, she loved him, but she still really missed her father. So with her children in her arms, she went back to heaven, something like that. So I thought, she tells me, what do you think? What do you think? Isn't it just a fun story? What shall I say? So I said, yeah, it's a very interesting story. And she latches on, yeah, interesting story. And you know, just everyone knows this story. And of course I learned it when I was young. And we learned it, you know, we heard it. So I used it. And then at that time, advanced class, there was the non-heritage student. And also her English is not always very understandable. And also even heritage students got shocked. You know, the woodcutter, he's a bad guy, you know, watch hiding, and you know, the naked women, and then he stole it, and then she got married, and what about the stupid fairy, you know? They were just naked, and she followed him and got married. Ridiculous! And I was really shocked. It was between old and new, could be, or Eastern, Western, you know, all intermingled. And I felt her voice was becoming quite sad and was breaking. I could feel the emotion in her voice. And she said, but it's kind of a moral issue, and we talked about it. So eventually we decided not to teach the materials because it may be offensive. But I still think it's still a famous story in Korea. And without learning or knowing the specific story, they may not know the basic Korean culture. So I'm not sure still. But anyway, something like this. So some gaps, I try to bring it up and then to discuss about it so that we can practice the language. And at that point, my heart broke because basically it was the failure of bringing about that story, and you can always go back to grammar, and you can always go back to practicing the subjunctive. So I barged in and I said, it's almost the story, it's almost your story. You have your students here, and you have, and now you're in America. Now, how much do you identify? And I had not even finished my word identify that she latched on and said, I think that's the same thing. I live here, but whenever I go to Korea, I miss here, but whenever I live here, I miss Korea. Somewhere, something like I'm in between. And that was, in fact, the point of her story. But it only came absolutely at the end. So when we ask, what was she trying to convey to her students? Well, we have 3 stories in there. We have the original folktale, told to Amy by Claire and told by Amy to Claire and Lihua, which is an English summary of the story that she told her students in the classroom. The second story is the account of the storytelling itself, and how her students ridiculed her and made fun of a story that was obviously very close to her heart, or to her cultural heart at least. And then in the end, the third story is the story of Amy's personal cultural experience mapped onto the Korean fairy tale. So telling your story or sharing experience in the classroom is not without risk. You put your own self on the line, and what do you do with that? So when she decided not to tell that story anymore, for me that was an example of what I have called a story under erasure, self-censorship. And there is quite a bit of self-censorship in our teachers' testimonies. The stories that they don't tell because they don't feel they can tell, or because they've been burnt telling those stories. So here is Amy again. I asked them why she decided not to tell the story, and she says, because we teach language. For the purpose of teaching language, we use, or we kind of introduce culture as the kind of medium. I think culture is just a medium for teaching language. It's not a culture course, it's not a content course, it's a language course, basically. It's to make them speak. It's not a political class, it's a language class. It's not that I don't want to teach culture, but it's that I'm cautious that I don't focus more on cultural content of the politics, economic issue, rather than the language. And of course, these teachers fear to be called to the dean, to have to justify their teaching. And I say, but all language teaching is both language and culture, isn't it? And she says, I'm not sure, I mean, you may not understand, but in our field, it's so not, language class, it's kind of treated like under or low. Language teachers are low on the totem scale as compared to professors of literature, etc. And some compared to content class. And some language instructors, they want to be content professors. Do you know what I mean? So, and then they have enough background because they have a PhD in linguistics. And that was sad to hear. So I'm going to jump in now in the interest of time. I want to tell you now another story, which is the story of Lihua herself, so that you can see the difference in the way they tell the story. This is the story of Lihua's, who tells the story of her auntie's bound feet. That came because Zhao Jing herself talked about her own grandmother having bound feet. And so Lihua, who is 65, so she's a more experienced teacher, she's from Shanghai with a PhD in Germanic linguistics, as you know. She did her PhD with us, is coordinator of the Chinese language program at UC Berkeley. And here is the English translation to give you a flavor of how she talks about her grandmother, her auntie's bound feet. My auntie, she had bound feet. And she does that in Chinese at the 4th semester level with a lot of gestures and a lot of repetitions, and I will comment a little bit on how does she bring this complex story to her students, despite the difficulty, the lexical and linguistic difficulty of doing that in Chinese in the classroom. So she says, my auntie, she had bound feet. So first, foregrounding the nominalization right there, this pragmatic way of starting the sentence. She was the oldest child in my mother's family, and my mother was the second. Her family lived in a rural area. So think about it, she says to her students. Think about it. She brings them in. Think about it. She was not from a wealthy family, but from a poor family. So she uses the contrast and the repetitive way of telling the story. But she also had bound feet. It's because bound feet at that time were thought of being beautiful. The family hoped to be able to marry her out. She had to work in the field, so you may think how painful it was for women to work in the field with bound feet. Think about it. So there's Lihua addressing her students and bringing them in. Working in the field and doing all sorts of things. So it's, as I remember, it's around the time when I was in first grade in elementary school. I was in first grade, that only 8 years old, and I saw this aunt coming into the house and my mother telling her she had to wash her feet. Imagine washing your feet when nobody washes their feet in public in China. You don't do that. That's your privacy. That's your private sphere. So there she was, and she says it was in a village suffering from famine. So when she arrived, because she was quite thin and small, quite short, I felt when I saw her on the first day, she seemed to be very tall because I was small and she was so tall. So she would do that to bring across that story. So what she tells them, and I won't give you the whole story, basically, is that through the way of structuring her narrative with a lot of repetitions, she tells how this aunt, out of shame, having to wash her feet, and her mother, her sister, insisting that she washes her feet, she was so shamed that she lowered her head lower and lower and lower. And she repeats that word, and the students understand not only the words, but the feelings that go with the words and the feeling of shame. She manages to convey that feeling of shame and lack of privacy. So she uses recastings. She says famine, but then she says food shortages. She simplifies the structures. A lot of gesturing. She uses pragmatic foregrounding. She uses direct discourse. You must wash your feet. There's no you've got to, says the sister. Tag questions, right, you know, etc., etc. So she uses a lot of very dialogic strategies to bring the story across, to bring the students into her world, so to speak. And she tells you down below that she can do that already in the 4th or the 5th semester. So she overcomes, if you wish, the linguistic obstacle. And this is how she justifies telling her students that story. She said, I wanted students to know my understanding of my auntie's feelings in later years. So here is a teacher who doesn't just give encyclopedic information about an old Chinese custom, but the feelings that it elicited in her, the subjective understanding of what did it mean. She felt ashamed because my mother exposed her privacy. And I wanted the students to learn the Chinese word for privacy, which is this. And I say, but does the word privacy mean the same thing in Chinese and English? You see, I'm always asking for equivalence. And she says, no, it's not. In those days, there was no such thing as privacy in China. We didn't have a word for it because the concept didn't exist. Today, the Chinese word is a translation from the English, and everybody knows what privacy means. But in those days, on a different time scale, it didn't exist. So I said Shu Liang used that word to explain why she doesn't tell stories about herself in the classroom, because it's her privacy. She says, I'm a language teacher, I'm not paid to tell my stories in the classroom. That's my privacy. So she used the word privacy to justify her lack of telling the story. So Lihua says, yeah, so washing your feet is part of your private life. And I can't help saying, well, I don't think that in English washing your feet is such a private affair. But I'm being facetious, of course. So this is the story. Basically, what Lihua injects in her story is not only the facts, but she is courageous enough to tell her students that she felt ashamed because she witnessed the shaming of her aunt having to wash her feet, and she has never forgotten that experience in her own biography. So she revealed an aspect of herself that even though she was only 8 years old and so not responsible for the shaming of her aunt, she is answerable to her students about that, because she is now teaching them Chinese, and she has to translate that experience into a language that they understand. So I'm looking at the time that is leaving, so I want to move on to my last story that I told that created quite a scandal among the undergraduates, and you will understand why. This is Ines, who is a Dutch native speaker and has been teaching beginning and intermediate Dutch for 19 years in the US. And when I asked her whether she shared experience and how difficult it was to translate her experience into Dutch for her American students, she chose that story. And I will read it to you the way she said it. I tell this story, which is a very dramatic story. It still gives me the chills when I tell it. But I had a friend who was my age, 2 young children. She was terminal. And it was one of those cancers that have a horrible sort of end. She didn't want to have that end. She decided she wanted to pull the plug when she felt she was ready. So she gave this huge party, invited all her friends and family. At this party, her father was a GP. She wanted her father to do it. So she says, middle of the party was still going, right? She says to her dad, Dad, I'm ready. And they go upstairs. And her mother's in the living room and sees them going upstairs and says, are you really ready to do it just now? You're still, you know. But nope, they went upstairs and they did it. And that is something that is also, again, it's a very pragmatic thing. It's a very dignified way to die. Now, euthanasia is a very problematic thing to discuss in a country like the States that is still, I think, very 19th century in terms of religious beliefs. And what I do is I present them with this story and I tell them why euthanasia works for the Dutch. And I'm not telling them that they should accept that, as you know, their worldview, if they disagree with this story or disagree or not disagree with it. But if they disagree with euthanasia, I totally respect that. I understand that. So I'm not here to change their worldview, but I'm here to widen their horizon just a little bit so that they can see again, sort of to get outside of themselves and take this sort of critical look at themselves and see, hey, there's some people in the world that do it differently. So how does Ines translate, unlike Lihua, in a different way, this kind of untranslatable or untransmissible experience as a Dutch person of an element of Dutch culture which is fundamentally shocking to her American students? So I have replicated here, and the story itself only takes, as you can see, the passage in red. All the rest is meta talk on that story. And I've listed down below kind of the strategies. How does she do that? And it's not just a question of vocabulary, it's a question of conveying feelings that are totally provocative and paradoxical and shocking to her American students. She appeals to emotions. She says herself, this is a dramatic story. It gives me the chills when I say it. Now you would say, she's been 19 years in the US. Why does it still give her the chills? Why does it give her? She's Dutch. So why does it give her the chills? Well, that's because it's going to give her students the chills. And so she puts herself in her students' shoes and she says, it gives me the chills, like it probably is going to give you the chills when I tell that story. She draws on familiar discourses. It works for the Dutch. Euthanasia works for the Dutch. It doesn't work for you, but it works for me. It works for us. So she's using a pragmatic, functional vocabulary. She manipulates the sentences and the point of view. When she says, the mother says, are you sure you want to do that now? And then as a narrator she says, but nope, they went upstairs and they did it. The nope is in fact the voice of the narrator. It's not the girl and it's not her mother. Nope is the narrator. So she changes the voices and the perspectives and point of view. And she uses all the discursive resources at hand, reported speech, and deictics, to in fact give different perspectives on that shocking event for her students. It doesn't mean to say many students will be shocked, but she has at least reached out to them. So let me conclude, because I think I'm running out of time. What I want to say is that our classes are becoming more and more multilingual. Culture is no longer the homogeneous things of neither an American or a French or a German or a Korean or a Dutch. It's becoming much more complex to teach culture in language classes because many teachers don't feel it's their responsibility. They don't want to touch it because it's politically incorrect. Because it might jeopardize their chances as vulnerable lecturers on their campus. They don't want to lose their students. If they lose their students, they lose their job. And so it's in their interest to keep everybody happy and not touch controversial topics. However, and I quote here from Manuel Castells in his book, The Power of Identity, the more the world becomes global, the more people feel local. And the more they give meaning to their lives based on their local own personal experience. So you don't explain the world on a global stage. You learn through your subjective experience that are steeped in the contingency of history. So one could say that the more global the means of communication, the more local the means of meaning making. Which is why I looked at the wording of these narratives to see how did the teachers make meaning that was transmissible, shareable, which is the point of learning a foreign language. I was right now at a conference in St. Louis, and a professor of German said something that struck me quite emotionally when he said, because there was somebody in the audience who had said we don't need to read Kafka or anybody else in German anymore, we can read him in English. So who needs German nowadays? You can read everything in English. And he answered, Kafka did not write the castle, he wrote das Schloss, which is the German word for castle. But the word das Schloss in German has totally different, evokes different things, has a different indexicalities than the castle. The castle, you imagine Henry VIII or Mary Stuart or these medieval European castles, das Schloss. And if you know German, you will see that the root of das Schloss does a job on your imagination, and you imagine something different from a castle. And in fact, I like to say that what I studied in France to become a professor of German I did not study German in France. I studied l'allemand. That was the foreign language that I learned, not German. Different resonances, different evocations. So translating culture in our global age requires us more than ever before to link the choice of signifiers. What I call signifiers is the shape of the words, the word privacy, the word Schloss, the word castle, all those words that the teachers used to tell their stories, and focusing on the wording itself with their social and historical context of production and reception. So when we teach culture, we're no longer just teaching baguettes and croissants. We're teaching, in fact, the subjective and historical resonances of words that are together inevitably part of the language. So this is really a summary of what I've just said. Ultimately, translating culture requires a high degree of reflexivity on what it means, and I quote here some of the 3 books that have inspired me in that line of thought, which is Bourdieu, Ce que parler veut dire, what it means to speak, ce que parler veut dire, what it means to speak and to take the floor, to speak the language of others, that is Paul Ricoeur, with the soi-même comme un autre, oneself like another, and to make yourself understood by others, and I recommend Judith Butler, 2005, giving an account of oneself, which is very good reading for the soul. So on that note, I will thank you for your attention.